My guest today claims that we are already past the tipping point when it comes to so many of the global conflicts that media is hotly debating. What's occurring in Europe? What's occurring in the Middle East? What's occurring in the South China Sea? My guest today, David Murrin, says the outcome is already a foregone conclusion. So we unpack that today. My name is Jay Martin. This is The Jay Martin Show, where we dissect the greatest minds in geopolitics and finance so that we can better understand the world. And if you enjoy my content, right beneath this video is a link where you can subscribe to my weekly Sunday essay. I distribute this to over 50,000 investors, and I honestly love writing it. I'd love to have you join the team. Just hit that link below. Here is David Murrin. Enjoy.
This is Jay Martin.
All right, I'm back with David Murrin. David, it's great to have you back on the program. Thanks for making the time.
It's always a pleasure to be with you, Jay.
So I have about 17 different headlines I want to talk to you about today, like no shortage of stuff since the last time I had you on the program, lots to get caught up on. I thought maybe one of the most timely pieces that we could begin with today would be the proposed Russian peace deal. So this is recent. As I understand, Putin put a proposal sort of through routers, actually not directly from the Kremlin, I think, which gives him the ability to deny it officially if need be. But it would propose a peace deal along current lines within Ukraine. So territory that's been lost would be lost, but if it's not gained, it won't be gained, and we'd cease here. What are your thoughts on this development? Is it substantial, or what do you think?
Look, Russia is on a war footing, and he's appointed a new minister for war, and his sole job is to maximize Russian output. Once you do that, you never, ever turn back. In history, nations never turn back from that precipice and Rubicon, in effect. And all they do is continue expanding until someone stops them or they win. So that's the first relevant piece. And Russia is in that state. And the West needs to really wake up as to what we're facing. A fully mobilized Russia intent on using peace or war to expand its military to keep moving. And Putin has used peace deals to just dangle like a fishing hook in front of Western appeasers all over the place. And it's designed to split, fragmentate, create doubt, create the possibility that, oh, peace is coming, we don't have to give them weapons. It's just a piece of strategic information manipulation that shapes the terrain and is designed to undermine the Western response.
So it's a head fake and nothing more, you think?
Absolutely.
And I noticed after the proposal was made, Russia launched an offensive into Kharkiv simultaneously, which would undermine and gave me the reason to question the legitimacy of it. But I wanted to get your take on that.
At the moment, despite incurring some pretty significant casualties, Russia is grinding away at Ukraine. Ukraine doesn't have the benefit of GPS-guided HIMARS and Excalibur artillery rounds because Russian EW has now shut them off again. And at the same time, it has HIMARS, it has obviously ATACMS, and which is why it hit a radar system that has a dual use as a strategic early warning system, because it also provided coverage for when ATACMS are coming through the air. So at the moment, Ukraine is really on the back foot. It's been ground down for 6 months, losing casualties it can ill afford to with a smaller population, and it doesn't have the weapons it really needs to best stabilize its front. So why would Putin ever go for peace under those conditions?
And so your perspective on the executive reshuffling in the military within Russia, Sergei Shoigu, the Ministry of Defense, has been removed and maybe promoted depending on how you look at it, but regardless, replaced. And a handful of executives within military leadership have been replaced in the last week. And your thoughts on this? What are your thoughts on this? Because some people are looking at it as a point of weakness. I'd say, look, if I'm leading an organization and my leaders aren't performing, it's a strength to be able to do the hard thing and replace them. Is that what's occurring here? What's your take?
For example, Shoigu was replaced when Russia's on the front foot and advancing. So it's unlikely to be he's been removed for failure. He's 100% loyal to Putin. In fact, that's what initially the press saw it as, but he popped up and he turned out to be alongside Putin when he was meeting with Xi. Yeah. So that was probably a promotion, if we're honest. And you can see that just like Albert Speer was brought into the German war machine, and to basically turn the whole country into a weapons-producing war machine, which he did from 43. The current replacement for Shogo is exactly that. A very capable economist who will galvanize the wartime economy of Russia. And once you enter into that process, believe me, you're not coming back from it. Because once you militarize a society, you reduce its revenues or the structure that would give it peacetime revenues, and you only complete your mission when you've grabbed enough stuff to compensate for the initial military expenditure. So Russia's in a state where it's coming for everyone, and everyone needs to wake up despite these little fishing exercises of Putin offering peace secretly. It's not coming.
So I've been paying more and more attention to the Sahel region in Africa, and I'm surprised it's not getting more media attention than it's getting. I want to know if you think I'm overthinking this or putting it up on a podium, which it does not deserve. But I look at the developments. I look at the military aid being sent from Russia through Libya. I think 5 Russian frigates just since April, packed full of military equipment that is being distributed through the Sahel region. I look at the Wagner Group being rebranded as Africa Corp and setting up essentially regime change insurance agreements with governments through the Sahel region. And obviously in exchange for this, they get access to, gold reserves, oil reserves, diamond reserves, uranium deposits, and a handful of commodities. But in addition, they're making friends outside of U.S. sanctions. That seems to be the real key here. And it's very strategic, very aggressive. U.S. is now withdrawing from Niger, which was a surprise to me 6 months ago. What's your take on that?
Look, we're facing a global scale chessboard, and the axis of autocracy is playing chess all over the globe. And wherever the axis of democracy or the alliance of democracy has withdrawn influence, it immediately moves into the vacuum. And Africa's the perfect case. It's a huge resource basin. And at the moment, the Chinese understand that they can't reach it in the early phases of a world war. So what they're really enacting is a denial strategy that's ejecting the West from the region. They're creating militaries, infrastructures, pro-axis of autocracy governments, and they're basically seeking to deny Africa to the West in that initial stage of a global confrontation, where we can't get our troops in to clear the access ways because we'll be stretched, paper thin everywhere else. So a very clever strategy. Stretches all the way down to South Africa. And so with the relationship with the ANC, who obviously tomorrow may be less a majority power than they were today, because the elections look like they're ending up with a coalition with the DA, which is interesting because it sort of brings the balance back. But up until now, they've had a strong relationship which governs the tip of Africa. And all across Africa, whether it's China or Russia, they've been involved in operating in the vacuous space where American and British foreign policy and French foreign policy have created vacuums. So we've strategically created a real problem for ourselves, because in the initial stages, we're going to have to treat it much like Africa was in 1914, a period of cleaning out the opposition. Only we don't have a lot of resources, and it's going to be a similar type of conflict that'll take a year to clear out the opposition if we control the sea lanes either side of it. So it's a denial exercise, and it comes with benefits in between of strengthened resource chains before outright conflict. You get as much out as you can, and that's worthwhile, and it's a snub in the nose to the West.
Now, what would you have to say to somebody who says, maybe they're coming from the American perspective and they're saying, that's not our business. We need to be engaging in less conflict. Africa is not America. We should leave it alone, and they should be free to make their own decisions uninfluenced by foreign powers. What would you have to say to that response, David?
Well, I think, first of all, one has to remember that the Ukraine was thoroughly influenced by foreign powers in the revolution that threw out Russian interests and started the process in 2014. So the idea that America doesn't influence other countries in its sphere of influence is somewhat naive. And I would say, what is America? A country or an empire? And one of the interesting things about the American empire is most Americans don't think America's an empire. They don't realize that the wealth they have derived decades of benefit from comes through this extended sphere of influence through maritime power that is an empire, not a colonial system, but a system that extracts dollar worth through democracies globally. And at the moment, that attitude has weakened the sphere of sort of American dollarization to the point where it's about to get very nasty for the American system. Because if you don't maintain your borders and your boundaries, then the systems within it that feed you basically disappear and you get less food. So I would argue that you need to choose your battles always. But America needs to understand what it really is. It's not a nation. It's a shadow empire. That's what it's been running since 1945. And because it hasn't realized it is a shadow empire, it's been prepared since Obama to see those boundaries squeezed. Now the margins that supplied the whole system are really, really skinny to the point of non-existent.
So fair to say, if I'm interpreting you correctly, there's a large percentage of Americans who do not see the relationship between the abundance that they enjoy and their strategic depth externally, globally, right? When you say borders and boundaries, you're not talking about New York to LA, right?
We're talking about globally, the global footprint of the world's up until now maritime hegemony,
and
which followed in the footsteps of Britain, but our extraction method was colonial. America's extraction method is ensure democracies are in place and use dollarization to extract wealth from in effect, alliances which are second tier and not as powerful as themselves.
And that misunderstanding between the abundance enjoyed at home and the strategic relationships and defense required abroad, and the misunderstanding of how that is linked, how closely is that tied to American opposition when it comes to supporting Ukraine or supporting Israel or supporting any foreign wars these days?
It's deeply corrosive to the concept of supporting what many of the people, the Magda Republicans, don't realize is that they have almost fatally undermined Ukraine over the 6 months. There's been undermining of Israel, for example, because it can't complete the mission of clearing out Gaza because of Biden's political ambitions to keep two states that are semi-Muslim. I mean, all over the place, that's self-sabotage in its ultimate extent. And it comes through the process of America not fully appreciating what it is. It's not a colonial empire, but it's a dollarized empire. A dollarized empire that uses a military footprint to ensure democracy within that footprint and to extract dollar worth, which has sustained the American way of life since 1945. But it's now reached an unsustainable level because the boundaries are being impeded upon on all sides. And the net result is actually the abundance that was America is about to reverse. Increasingly, it has been reversing in a way that if people understood what was going on, they'd call for the boundaries to be reasserted. Only it's all too late.
And it's all too late. Now, when I think about that sentiment, where it lies today in response to how involved America should be in these quote unquote foreign wars, and then I relate that to like World War I and World War II, could you say that it was really similar, though, before America was directly threatened in World War I, meaning there's submarines and ships that were bringing food supplies to Britain? I think it was the Habsburgs that said, now open warfare on any ships delivering supplies to the UK. That's when America got serious about entering the war because their civilians or their military personnel, and similar in World War II. And then until
what are the similarities between today and the previous two world wars and America's role in them? That would be the question that I would pose in the reverse.
Okay.
And I'm going to make the analogy that World War I is actually very similar to the World War III that we have already, I would say, started with the invasion of Ukraine and the activities of Iran, which are at war with Israel, America, and Britain in the region. And the first thing we've got to kind of realize is what was the prime motivator? The prime motivator in 14 was Germany was challenging Britain within the super Western Christian Empire. This was a civil war within the system, and essentially, as part of that, America was isolationist up until then. Now, it's little known that the American economy was as big as the empire economy was. But you hadn't really militarized, because after your civil war, you just expanded yourself into the rest of this huge landmass. Then you had a war with Spain, which wasn't an accident. It was basically a war to get hold of all the Spanish possessions, which allowed America to then become a Pacific power and spread itself across the Pacific. And that was its first external step of empire outside the boundaries we know of. So America as a democracy was just as able to expand like all systems do virally as far as it would go. Now, you didn't have a real wartime system or economy on the scale that Britain, France, and Germany had that had been tooling up for at least a decade for this conflict. And you were reluctant to be involved with it. As you quite rightly said, though, there were issues of arms supplies as you moved into sort of 15, 16. And there's a Lusitania that was sunk, which was it's now known carrying ammunition. But the real trigger that flipped America in when it didn't want to be was twofold. One, the sense of having seen Russia come out of the war, that actually, being part of it would be advantageous to America for those who were strategically inclined, because suddenly you'd be ensconced back in the old world of Europe. So by taking part, you would then be involved in the old world, not just isolated in continental America. And the other one was the Zimmermann letter, which basically was intercepted by British intelligence. And that was the German attempt to get Mexico to invade America, right, to keep it wrapped up. And that was the trigger that finally got an isolationist America engaged. And with that engagement, the key part of it wasn't warships, although there were some battleships involved. By then, Britain had beaten the Germans in Jutland. It was much more about the 2 million American doughboys that turned up under Pershing. That meant that the Germans had limited time left to do something, which inspired them, having knocked the Russians out of the war through the revolution, which was actually inspired by German intelligence. They would then gain to the Kaiser's offensive in the spring of 1918. So America's involvement triggered responses by Germany, which then forced the best of their soldiers to be expended in the offensive, to exhaust themselves and not get far enough to break the deadlock, even though they got up to 100 miles from the original starting point. It was much bigger than people think of. And that meant that by the summer of 1918, Britain was able to execute the Battle of Amiens, which was a revolutionary form of warfare, and it encountered a German force where it had taken all its very capable, maybe 1 in 10 soldiers, 1 in 20, the moral fibre of the platoons and companies, and put them in stormtrooper battalions that all died. So when they were faced with this onslaught, they were less able to receive it. And Allied air power was quite dominant at that stage, and combined arms warfare came into being. So America's role was very significant in terms of forcing Germany to do things, but actually in the way that it moved forward, it was actually much more a British thing to be success than it was a French or German thing, even though they were able to move as the Germans retreated. But what happened next is really intriguing, because America was expansionary. So what does it do? It invests in the renovation, and it invests in Germany to the point where when the 1929 crash took place, this is so intriguing, what does it do? It withdraws all its money from Germany, and that creates a total economic collapse of Germany and creates a fertile ground for the rise of Nazism, which is the second half of the German challenge against Britain's power. So that was really part two of what is a hegemonic conflict with a 112-year cycle that started in 1914. The bit that was new was Japan, the first part of a rising Asian system challenging American and British power in Asia. That was an add-on in the Second World War. And obviously that created the Pacific War that we're all very familiar with, which is actually, I would say, a blueprint for the way the Chinese see their expansion in the region, because they've got the same topographical limitations. They're just a bit further inside the island chains. So it's an interesting bellwether. Now, obviously, in the Second World War, supplies started flowing far, far earlier and in far greater numbers. And America understood that if it tooled up and became the arsenal of democracy, it would do two things. It would support Britain. It would receive a large amount of money from Britain, which would transfer wealth from the old empire to the empire that was America in the process, impoverishing us in the mechanism, and also reconstitute armed forces where they could take on both the Pacific theatres and the Atlantic and the European continental systems. Now, what's really intriguing is we've missed a massive trick in America and Europe to not be doing the same right now. We should be tooling up our industrial bases to supply Ukraine, not letting them do that inside Ukraine, but outside, and then taking credit because Ukraine has oil and gas, and if victory takes place, it will be able to repay those debts. So we retool ourselves as America did in the 1940s, and that enables us to then be prepared for both Ukraine support and our own support. But somehow no one's really cottoned on to how we should be doing that.
Well, somehow would be the question, I suppose. So, two speculations there, David. Number one, is it because American public sentiment doesn't support it? And maybe that's because the equivalent of a Zimmerman letter or the equivalent of a Pearl Harbor attack hasn't occurred in this conflict yet, and maybe it needs to sway public opinion aggressively.
Look, I think that's exactly what it will take. I mean, there's a tendency to be continentally isolated, and there's a denial as to the very nature of American wealth, which is the shadow empire rather than the nation. And
Right.
all of that requires action. Now, so far, Biden has been trying to dampen the Ukraine conflict down, dampen everything that happens in the Middle East, even if it means sabotaging and betraying the allies that go with it, that actually, by undermining them, means you're more likely to be in conflict ultimately than not at all. And I agree with you. I think the only time America will realize it's a war is when China makes its move, which my thesis is, I call it the red lightning scenario. It's way bigger than Pearl Harbor. It's a mass missile attack which eradicates American forces inside the second island chain in the first hours of combat. And by then, this is a problem the West faces. We face an onslaught that is so brutal in the opening period that we're going to be very lucky to recover, to come back as we did in World War One and World War Two, because of the size of the Chinese industrial base means that in any extended conflict, as long as they can get their resources to them, which is what the relationship between China and Russia is over land, then they can make their industrial base work. You just have to look at Chinese shipbuilding. It's terrifying in terms of the number of ships it can build and outbuild the rest of the world on a staggering basis.
Okay, so then sticking with that region, you mentioned the second island chain. We'll maybe stay in the South China Sea then. What do you make of this news that China has announced it will now arrest foreign trespassers in the South China Sea, which includes an area that is essentially the Philippine Economic Zone, is this like, it seems like a very intentional escalation tactic. We're going to now draw a line around you and tell you if you cross that line, you're in trouble. So just don't cross the line. But turns out you need to.
There is a clear escalatory path that China is walking. And I'd say there are really, like the big moment is the recognition that China is providing lethal aid to Russia. Semi-lethal aid, lethal aid, whatever it is, it's there. And the recent visit, by the US to China was about saying, don't do that. And I'm sure she said, and what are you going to do about it? And then the next step is essentially on the election of, a Taiwanese politician who's anti-Chinese. They don't just semi-blockade Taiwan, they completely lock it up, which is another aggressive stance. And then this particular process where the Philippines, which is now basically becoming a land aircraft carrier for the American fight-back construct of missile-based systems all across the Philippines, which are a real challenge to the Chinese because it's aerial denial systems in reverse. The very system that's pushing America out could also be a massive problem for the Chinese in maintaining their second island chain vision of complete control. But it's all happening too slowly. And that's why the Chinese are escalating, is the American response is not adaptive enough. It's not fast enough to actually get ahead of the deterrence curve. And so this escalation, I think we're seeing, of which the incident you mentioned is one of a sequence, I think we can expect that to really accelerate. At the beginning of the year, I really talked about this year as being the risk year for China to make its big move, because it had changed its economy from a manufacturing export economy to one that had an internal demand gap, which was obviously why they're in financial difficulty, and it's tooled up its system to be far more at war than we'd imagine, or be preparing for war. And there's a moment when you have to go under that status, and I think it's far closer than most people even realize. It could be any time from now going forwards, in my estimation.
And I want to pull on that thread a little bit, David. I know we talked about this in our previous interview, but what do you expect that action to look like? This is the year that China makes its big move. Everyone's eyes are on Taiwan. Is that the right place to look?
Not really. No. Because if you're a Chinese planner and you realize that you are going to do something in Taiwan, you can't take it in a lightning coup, in a de facto moment. You have to blockade it, strangle it, get control of American submarines, or at least, fight them back before you can get any amphibious force over to the limited beaches. So Taiwan is not a quick take. And in the meantime, you can rest assured the Japanese come to the Taiwanese aid because they realize forward defense is critical for their islands. And if the Japanese move, America has to move. So any Chinese planner that wants to go after Taiwan has to calculate that it's going to face everything. South Korea, Japan, America, Australia, anything that turns up from NATO will all come together, and they don't want that. So far better you just go straight to go and you say, okay, we'll eradicate everything we can inside the second island chain with mass missile forces fired by surprise in saturation, and then what are you going to do? We can take Taiwan whenever we want to. The only thing they then have to deal with is the US Air Force, long-range strikes, and what's left of a submarine fleet, which is less and less operational in the US, that has to travel a long way, fire a few missiles and go back. So it looks to me very, very much like the only conclusion, if I was a Chinese planner, was all at once, Pearl Harbor on steroids, do it properly, effectively kill the carriers in harbour, don't let them be out at exercise, so you fight them later on at Midway in the Coral Sea.
Is there not a more strategic way to get this done for China other than, Pearl Harbor on steroids? Is that the most likely option, do you think? Or is there something more strategic and subtle and less violent, I suppose?
Well, we've lived in a period of a covert Chinese challenge. And the reason why you do things covertly is you have ambitions, but you can't go toe-to-toe with your enemy. But they're now at a stage when they can. And you'll notice they're becoming more overt and more politically aggressive. That's because they know they can. And they've also seen something which is really all new weapon systems like anti-ship ballistic missile systems, which the challenge is based upon, now supplemented by hypersonic weapons. Basically, when you have a new weapon, any politician will ask of the military, do you think it'll work? But now, thanks to the Red Sea, we've watched the Houthis, with very basic versions of systems like that, close the waterway. And it's something that people should be talking about at dinner in all geopolitical circles. Is America is a global maritime hegemony, and it can't keep the Red Sea open to shipping. It's been defeated by the Houthis. And, it should have been more aware of the fact that Houthis had been battle-hardened by the Saudi Arabians and the war with them and learned techniques that perhaps they should have taken for granted they could deal with. But it's mainly the biggest issue is there are not enough anti-ship ballistic missile systems in the US destroyers to protect all the targets. And even then, you can saturate them. We haven't seen saturation attacks. We've seen cruise missile, we've seen ballistic missiles, and we've seen drones in combination fired by the Houthis, but nothing like the Chinese could deal with. I mean, if you put SM-3s and SM-6s in three Aegis-class warships, they are only capable of 3 times 14 intercepts. So, 50 missiles kills the warships and the carrier. That's the saturation level. And they're way above that. And they also have DF-17s, which go straight through our defenses with hypersonic glide weapons. They've developed the tools to basically push America out of the second island chain. It's interesting the US Air Force realizes that they can't survive the initial strike, and they've stopped positioning their air wing at Kabana in Japan, and they forward base into smaller strips, hoping diversification helps. But why the hell the US Navy sells its carriers in the destructive range is beyond me. It's hubris. What we really should be doing is withdrawing those carriers and then putting an emphasis on marine-type littoral combat units, which use missiles and radars, both in cruise missiles and surface-to-air missiles, to control envelopes in the region and slow the Chinese expansion. Because there will come a time when those carriers get the weapons to defend themselves, when lasers come online, and they have a lot of power as nuclear ships. So wasting them in the early stages of a conflict doesn't make sense to me. And if I was the US Navy, I'd change my strategic how I would wish to operate. And I'd save those vehicles, those ships, for when I can defend them properly. And at the moment, defense is not capable of dealing with mass saturation.
Right. Okay, so we talked about public sentiment in the U.S. a little bit and what it might take to shift that sentiment, and looked at events like the Zimmerman letter and Pearl Harbor, which pivoted sentiment overnight. Seemingly, that event might not have occurred within this conflict, and when it occurs, I imagine your thoughts is that it'll occur too little, too late at that point. Outside of that cataclysmic event occurring, the Pearl Harbor event, how much weight would you put on just infiltration of American public opinion? I mean, we were chatting before we hit record about any sort of YouTube content that is pro-Ukrainian. Just scroll down and look at the comments, and you'll see the proliferation of Russian bots attacking the video. We've been infiltrated. Our news or information has very much been infiltrated, and that has successfully swayed, I would say, American public opinion. The reason I asked that question, sorry, I'll let you go there first, and then I have a follow-up.
Well, it's a very good point, and I'll answer and say we've already been totally infiltrated. We've been infiltrated on the information warfare domain, and we've been infiltrated because I think the Chinese intelligence services run rings around the open Western societies.
Interesting.
They've penetrated our industry and our defense systems. They've extracted USPs and designs, which have allowed them to jump the gap that if we had kept them away, it would have been 20 years and they might not have enough energy to make the challenge. So strategically over 24 years, they've been immensely successful of extracting all the knowledge that was meant to keep us safe. They've also got into all the public spaces of opinion. But they've got a couple of things that are interesting because it's not just about infiltration. One of the things that took place into 1914 was there was a very, very strong perception that how could the world go to war if it was so economically entwined? No one could do that because it was more entwined than it had been for hundreds of years. And people believed that entwinement between Germany and Britain and the other European countries would prevent conflict. And there was also a sense of 100 years of peace since 1915 and Waterloo, real fundamental peace between hegemonic, nations, was a period when people have forgotten war was relevant. They made the story up that they were too civilized, that no modern society would go to war in those conditions. Well, it did. So there's denial to do with hegemonic, dividend to do with Pax Britannia in that stage and Pax America now. And then there's another third element, which is so key, is money printing, which has been used by the Western America to compensate for lack of real productivity and lack of adaptation that would find and substitute for loss of productivity to find new ways through it, has been replaced by printing money, which made it look like the status quo was just great. And that process creates dopamine inside the whole of a nation. Because the markets are high, there's no reason to think we should fear anything. And therefore, if we don't fear anything, the cortisol response doesn't look around to see what's really happening. And lastly, because America is in decline, and I'm afraid it's about to be a disease of Britain too, or is a disease, is that linearity in our politicians means they just can't naturally see the intent of aggressors. They just think that they're living in the old world they were brought up in, not a new changed world. All those things have led to a monumental level of denial that quite honestly is going to be very lucky for us to respond to, because unlike the Ukrainians, who are a very tough nation, I would say they're multiples tougher than the West. And the West is going to get a real kicking before it gets a chance to wake up, I'm afraid, at this rate.
Yeah, I mean, recent history in Ukraine would toughen a population up. I mean, we haven't had that in the West. We've been very coddled.
They were tough before, Jay. I mean, much tougher if you met Ukrainians. I mean, they were the dark side of Europe, inverted commas, before this happened. No doubt. You're right. In comparison, we are super soft. We didn't call our last generation snowflakes for nothing.
Right. Well, there's been a misinterpretation about, I joke about this, but maybe I'll leave it alone. The misinterpretation about what the American dream's become, which was somebody departing where they're from, leaving everything they know and the people they love to venture to a new land in order to build a new life. It's a very daring move. And today it's like the American dream is being born in Orange County and going to Taco Bell. That's not going to do it. It's not enough. It's not the same mentality.
I mean, you are, of all the Western nations, you still have a warrior creed in your armed services, but it's slowly being diluted. And, I think it will be there. It will recover. But the question is, how can we get a population that's used to putting self over collective to actually step up to the plate?
Well, I want to find this stat, but it's something like 70% of Americans between the age of 17 and 25 are either too fat or have other medical disabilities that would disqualify them from military service. So the warrior creed, but you need bodies in those boots, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know.
And if I didn't live in our society, if I didn't believe in democracy as a route for human evolution and self-development, and I was looking on our society in judgment, I would say it's become weak, hubristic, and actually deserved to be wiped aside because it just couldn't defend itself.
Right. Yikes. Okay, so sticking with the infiltration concept, though, we talked about essentially digital infiltration, right, or covert infiltration. There's another event occurring that I wanted to get your thoughts on, and this is the U.S. southern border. And as a segue into this, we talked about Africa a little bit. We talked about Russia's success in co-opting many African nations in exchange for their natural resources. But the other advantage to controlling the Sahel region of Africa and the trade routes up to Libya is that this becomes a migrant route, right? And African migrants are flowing up to Europe, facilitated largely by the Russian military with the intention, as I understand it, of destabilizing European politics. And it's working.
Look at us, look at Estonia or look at Finland. They've all suffered the same process of basically Russia promoting the migration of populations to weaken the system. And the biggest failure for the West is if you think of us as a single organism and the skin is our borders and our boundary, the first place a human protects against infection is that particular boundary, our skin. And yet the boundaries of Western society, whether it's Europe or Britain, we're having an appalling problem with immigration. And I just don't understand why we can't actually enforce a border in Britain. And you've got the same problem with the southern border. It's just a lack of ability and willpower to enforce, to don't come through. And that's been used by the axis of autocracy in a massive way to destabilize. And the Chinese, for example, use it as a conduit for fentanyl. And, fentanyl is not a random event. Fentanyl is how the Chinese learned from the opium wars, where Britain forced opium on China and actually destabilized a weakened system because the opium addicts just lost all their values and construct, and added severely to this sort of, they call it the great period of humiliation. And they've just taken a leaf out of history and they're now applying it to America. And America needs to enforce its boundaries.
It's very important to recognize is that the fentanyl trade, the opium trade entering the United States is the same story on repeat. This is the opium wars in China. And I think it's very important to understand that period of history. There were two opium wars. There were really just one, in my experience, maybe with a period of peace in between. But it's important to understand that because you need to understand how that story ended, and it ended terribly.
Yeah, it did. And what's interesting was Britain didn't seek to interesting enough, Britain's motivation at that stage wasn't to occupy or bring down China. It just wanted to basically complete the T triangle. And it wanted to, so it was a trade-driven, greed-driven decision. But China's is actually a little different. It's not interested in selling for money. China's there because it wants to undermine America, because it wants to crush America. And that's a slightly different twist to it.
Well, and sort of, right? Because from Britain's perspective, yes, it would be, but from the Chinese perspective, it would not be, because they were just on the receiving end of the opium. So, when you think about the incentive from their perspective, it was just destabilization.
It felt no different. It was just humiliating. The thing again that's interesting is that, and I would argue, I have argued that, the pandemic was not an accident. It was an intentional release designed to weaken the Western world's debt provision. That's what it was targeted. And it's done it so well because look at the US debt problem. It's going through the roof as we speak. Mm-hmm. And you can't spend more money on interest than you can spend on defense. Now, that was an intentional stratagem. No one seems to realize what was done to us or don't want to admit to it. And yet fentanyl is exactly the same. It's another stratagem, which is covert, designed to undermine America. And the point is, at what stage do Americans wake up and realize they are consistently under attack? They're under cyber attack. What happened in Baltimore, even if it wasn't an attack, and I have to consider that, someone knows, but on the outside, I think the chances of a ship hitting one of the pillars of a very, very wide bridge seems to me a little strange. And especially at the same with another ship under New York Bridge had the same problems. But that, whether it was or wasn't an attack, and let's just put that in the conjecture stage, it represents what happens when American infrastructural issues are turned against America, when EV cars are used as surveillance tools and exploded because they've got software that comes from China. When, everywhere on every basis, America is under attack, and yet its immune system hasn't been triggered. And that's thanks to completely inept leadership on behalf of Biden. To the degree, you've got inept leadership, and Trump doesn't represent anything better because he left the US Navy in disarray, absolutely disarray. And we are suffering the consequences of that. What you're looking at is failed American leadership that's strong enough. If it was Reagan, just imagine what Reagan would be doing right now. He would come in and say, we're Americans. We have so much to be proud of. We have been preyed upon by our opposition, and we're going to close every single avenue of which they do it as quickly as we can.
Oh man, there's a lot I want to pull on there. Right before I do, though, I just want to follow up on the U.S. southern border. One last question, because recently I had on a guest who he was the director of counterterrorism for the CIA for 28 years. When I asked him about the U.S. southern border, I said, "Why is this being allowed to occur in the manner with which it is occurring? Because we have the ability to stop it, we're just not, right?" And his response was essentially, that is the great unanswered question. And it's the great unanswered question because this is a trafficking operation, and the only trafficking operation in the world with which we have no idea publicly, or we're not willing to acknowledge who's behind it. Every other, if you reduce and dehumanize it, it is a product being moved across the border in exchange for cash. And if you look at the drug trade, which is very similar, you can name the cartels, the Cali cartel, the El Chapos, et cetera, et cetera. It's like, why is nobody being named here? But it's a very lucrative industry. What's your take?
So, look, if you look at just come across the Atlantic to Britain, and we Brexited to control our borders. And in the past few years, the number of immigrants is absolutely staggering, way more than the people that come across on boats. And, as someone that sees that as a destabilizing factor, overloads our infrastructure, and certainly not part of the elected party's manifesto, it's gobsmacking. But there is a source that I suspect undermines the whole process of enforcing the borders, and that's our Treasury believe that only through immigration could it revitalize productivity in the country. And systems in decline are desperate to find ways to re-stimulate themselves. So if Britain is operating that sort of covert mechanism from the Treasury, which is then undermining everything else, America is in a similar position. And maybe it is the belief in some halls that only when the population grows can the economy grow, because you've reached a stagnation point and everything else follows from that.
So here's a common objection to the thought that immigration should be cracked down on. There's many common objections to it, but I'm a product of immigration. My grandpa just arrived on a boat on the East Coast. He didn't speak any English, didn't have any paperwork. Nobody knew where he was from. My last name, Martin, is the last name of the farmer who hired him. I don't know what the heritage is there, but that's so many of our background story. We just arrived, as a refugee, right? And then we built from there. How would you reconcile that lived experience with today's?
Let's rephrase it. How did immigration work for America in the early stages of its growth, such that it isn't working now?
Yeah,
that's the question, right? And it worked for America because Europe was by then pretty developed. Land ownership was in, a few's hand rather than the many. And, the average person had very little, to look up to apart from a hard life of work stuck in the lower classes. So taking this train or this ship, across the Atlantic may have brought risks with it, but it drove immigration, people with initiative, people that weren't prepared to accept a limited scenario and carving out their future. And they came from Europe predominantly, although there were many Chinese to balance that, but there were not as many, but there were predominantly Europeans. Europe was predominantly Christian, had some fairly shared values, whether we found our differences through conflict or conflict highlighted our differences. We had a lot of commonality. And because America was expanding and becoming and fueled by this as it moved west through its growth and its wealth, basically to become American also meant the opportunity to be wealthy and shared values. So that was successful. The trouble is when you infuse a system that's mature, it doesn't have anywhere to expand. It doesn't have any borders to push out. It's just going to plug up the system and gum it up because there's no infrastructure left you can build to go further and create more wealth. The cycle of wealth creation in America is you keep going west, you create wealth, you create oil, it feeds back in the system, lovely virtuous cycle. There's nothing like that in America that new immigration solves. So immigration works really well in the expansive phases of social organization and is very destructive in the opposite phases, which is what Britain and America face right now.
That's important.
Now, one of the challenges is I think immigration is a great concept, but there's a couple of limits to it. When someone immigrates, you've got to somehow infuse them into your culture. And one of the problems we face with Muslim immigrants is that they don't necessarily, it takes generations to become an English Muslim, whereas most of the Muslims that turn up from the Middle East are actually Syrian first, and they live in England. So that integration factor takes time. And if you can allow it to take time, you have to limit the stream, otherwise you get overwhelmed. And so that's very important in terms of cultures that are fundamentally different, is time is required. So if you saturate an old declining system with people that require a large amount of social integration, it's probably going to be unsuccessful, because in fact they come and they don't become wealthy because the opportunities aren't there, and then there's dissatisfaction, and before you know it, there's sectarianism.
Do you know of any examples, David, of a mature nation that had high volume of unregulated immigration, country was not able to expand to absorb effectively? Like, have we seen this movie played before, and where would that be?
We saw it in the Roman Empire.
Okay.
Originally it was built by Romans who fought in the army and became citizens. And 70% of the population was slaves. But later on in the 200, 300 AD period, the population wasn't big enough, so they started to take their enemies in. And before you know it, there wasn't this great surge of barbarianism. Actually, the Goths rose to power inside the legions and became emperors. So yes, we've seen it before. And one of the things that's interesting is that however much we think that the wave of immigration or the underclass of a society shares the values of the overclass that built it, they don't. So they never maintain it. And that's huge. I mean, we saw it. Obama characterized it, and this isn't meant to be a racist comment, but the moment the demographics shift such that the underclasses of the traditional empire system facilitate one of their number becoming powerful or moving into power, they don't appreciate the maintenance of the borders as much as the older segment, and they're far more about social integration and fairness, and in the process that begins the collapse. And Obama gave away more power than any other president in his 8-year term. And he actually seeded the Chinese challenge by not resisting properly, seeded the problem in Ukraine. All the problems we have now go back to Obama's weakness. And Biden has just taken the Obama playbook and added steroids to it.
Right. So, David, hypothetically, if you were raising young kids right now, maybe 3 boys, maybe they're 3, 5, and 7 years old, and you're looking at the global map and saying, where could I relocate to take my best shot at giving them the same opportunity that I was given? I grew up surrounded by opportunity, predictable, safe governance, all of this stuff. My wife and I are looking around today and asking that question, like, where could that be? And we're looking globally for sure. Putting down roots in Indonesia a little bit. Freedom to move through the states. There's some states that are, what I love about the US is that the sovereignty of the states, it's like a different country being in Idaho or Arizona versus New York or California. When you look at the globe, what's your take on that?
There'll be nowhere to go. And the problem is that China's ambitions are truly global. They are the eradication of all democratic systems. So you have a choice. There are places that might take them time to get to if their war is successful. But the truth is, I think unless we actually stand up and stop thinking about, how we can dodge it and actually don't face it, there will be nowhere to hide. And they've proven with their own population, the Uyghurs, the population of Hong Kong, they can suppress any number of people quickly with the electronic AI systems they've introduced. So in answer to your question, we're all going to have to do something and play a role if we're going to get through this.
What are you going to do?
I do it already. I've explained to people what's coming, tried to warn people that it is, it's inevitable unless we wake up. Our only chance is to wake up sufficiently to deter conflict. I'm afraid conflict is now inevitable because we've missed the deterrence window. And now we're going to battle to struggle when the first impacts of this thing takes place, is how we regain and how our linear leadership that essentially got us into this mess, like the Chamberlain government did, is replaced with a more adaptive government that makes better strategic decisions.
So if I were to interpret that answer a little bit, when I ask you, where could my family go to sort of weather the storm, your response is, stay put and do your part. Is that correct?
yes, you might be able to go to northern Canada, and you might, like hide up there and be okay, and everyone else, it goes through the mill. But I think that if we all did that, I guarantee you that northern Canada won't be safe either.
Yeah,
So it's really difficult. I think this is truly the first global war. We tend to think of World War II as global, but there were whole swathes of areas that were left untouched. The magnitude of the Chinese ambition and challenge means nowhere will be left untouched.
What's the portfolio look like to weather the storm, David?
Look, I've been a big fan of precious metals and Bitcoin since 18K.
Okay,
So
those are the lifeboats
I've
for
got
you.
I've got more sophisticated versions for my professional money managers,
Yeah.
but I'm very careful about talking about what to do, when to do it, because most people then do it late. And all of my clients have basically got in very early at the right stages and are now running their trades.
All right. Okay. Look,
But
David,
I would say this: you don't want to be in the bond markets. Do
expand.
not think bonds are a safe haven. Do
Okay.
not think the dollar is a safe haven. And do not think equity is a good place to be unless you're in wartime-orientated equity businesses, whether it's defense or resources, in spheres of influence that can be maintained by the West.
Okay. Look, David, thank you for coming back on today. It was, it's always enlightening chatting with you. I was going to say, it's not necessarily uplifting, but it's important. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And look, I'm going to just say this as I always do. It's really hard sometimes if we've been wearing rose-colored glasses and we look up and we found reality is very different.
Yeah.
And reality is very different from most people's perception. And why do we know that? We know that because most people are surprised at how the world has deteriorated so quickly, which means they weren't running a real world model. And the quicker we get a real world model in our heads, the quicker we can elect the right leadership, make better decisions, and give our children a future. But rose-colored glasses guarantees everyone a very rough time.
I agree. Okay. We'll leave it at that. Thanks again. And I look forward to doing it in the next few months. Let's do it again.
Thanks, Joe. I look forward to the mass bot attacks.
Yeah. All right. Awesome.